The viewport stretched before Ethan Cross like a canvas, painted by a civilization that had mastered the intersection of art and physics. Velithra Prime's orbital station curved away in both directions, its surface a living tapestry of bioluminescent metals that pulsed with soft azure light, as if the structure itself was breathing. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching tiny maintenance drones drift past like mechanical fireflies, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that his stomach was still somewhere near Mars. Envoy Cross, the Velithran delegation awaits your presence in the ceremonial atrium. Ethan turned to find a station AI's holographic projection hovering at shoulder height, its form a swirling geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. He'd been told the Velithrans found perfect spheres aesthetically offensive, which seemed like the kind of detail that would definitely be on a test he hadn't studied for. Right, yes, atrium, very ceremonial. He adjusted his formal jacket for the 15th time, convinced that the left sleeve was somehow longer than the right, though 3 mirror checks had confirmed otherwise. Quick question, when you say ceremonial, we're talking handshakes and wine, correct? Not blood oaths or ritual combat. The AI didn't answer, merely pulsed once and dissolved into particles of light. Great talk, Ethan muttered, grabbing his datapad from the narrow bench. The screen flickered, displaying the same frustrating message it had shown for the past 6 hours. Cultural brief, Velithran Customs, Section 7 of 23, downloading, 34% complete. Error, connection timeout. Somewhere in the Terran Coalition's diplomatic corps, someone had uploaded the wrong file format, or compressed it incorrectly, or perhaps just cosmically cursed this entire mission. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity could fold space-time for faster-than-light travel, but couldn't manage a reliable file transfer protocol. He'd read sections 1 through 6 so obsessively that he could recite them. He knew that Velithran handshakes involved touching fingertips in ascending order of rank, that their diet was primarily vegetarian with the notable exception of a fermented protein they served at celebrations, and that asking about someone's ear jewelry before the 3rd conversation was considered presumptuous. What he didn't know was everything in sections 7 through 23, which naturally would contain all the actually important information. The corridor beyond his arrival chamber stretched in curves that defied Euclidean geometry, walls flowing into ceiling in ways that suggested the architects had politely declined to acknowledge gravity's opinion on how buildings should work. Ethan followed the softly glowing pathlights embedded in the floor, passing the occasional Velithran citizen, who paused to regard him with open curiosity. They were striking, humanoid in form, but refined in ways that suggested evolution had been given a few extra million years, and possibly some aesthetic consulting. The women especially carried themselves with an elegance that made Ethan acutely aware of his tendency to slouch. And the ears. He tried not to stare, but the ears were impossible to ignore. Long, gracefully curved, rising from where human ears would be and extending upward to delicate points, they moved with subtle expressiveness. He'd seen one woman's ears tilt forward when she laughed at something her companion said, another's flat slightly in what might have been irritation when a service drone bumped her shoulder. It was like watching a conversation in a language he didn't speak, all the nuance flying past him at faster-than-light speed. Ambassador Cross. He turned to find a Velithran woman approaching, her formal robes a deep emerald that seemed to shift colors as she moved. Her ears were decorated with delicate silver chains that caught the bioluminescent light, and her expression carried the professional warmth of someone whose job was managing nervous aliens. Actually, it's just attaché, or really even just Ethan is fine, he said, managing the finger-touch greeting with only moderate awkwardness. I'm not technically. You are the Terran representative for today's proceedings, yes. Her Terran standard was flawless, though accented with a musical quality that made even bureaucratic questions sound poetic. Yes, but there's been a bit of a mix-up. You see, Ambassador Yuan was supposed to. Then you are the ambassador for our purposes. She smiled, and he noticed her ears had tilted forward slightly. Interest, amusement. He really needed those other 17 sections. I am Velrus, first counsel to the Queen's court. If you would follow me, the ceremony will begin shortly. Ceremony? That word again. Ethan's datapad chose that moment to emit a sad little chime and display download failed. Retry. He jabbed the retry button with perhaps more force than necessary. Might I ask what kind of ceremony we're? A celebration of alliance and cultural exchange, Velrus said smoothly, guiding him through an archway that seemed to grow from the floor like frozen water. Very traditional, very meaningful for our people's future relations. That sounded diplomatic enough to be either perfectly safe or catastrophically dangerous, with no middle ground. Ethan had been in enough government briefings to recognize carefully vague language when he heard it. They entered a preparation chamber where 3 attendants immediately descended on him, adjusting his jacket, smoothing his hair, and applying something to his collar that looked like a small holographic flower, but appeared to be some kind of translation booster. One of them, a young man with ears decorated in copper bands, stepped back and said something in Velithran that made the others laugh. He says you have very serious eyebrows, Velrus translated, her own expression carefully neutral. It is a compliment. We find human facial expressiveness quite charming. My eyebrows are honored, Ethan said, which earned another ripple of laughter and made him feel slightly less like he was about to walk into something he'd regret. Slightly. Through another doorway, down another corridor that curved in mathematically impossible ways, and then Velrus paused before a massive set of doors that appeared to be carved from a single piece of white wood, or possibly grown rather than carved. Beyond them he could hear music, haunting, layered harmonies that seemed to resonate in his chest. When you enter, the greeting delegation will be to your left. Acknowledge them with the formal finger touch we discussed. Then proceed to the center of the hall. You'll know what to do. He absolutely would not know what to do, but Ethan had learned that sometimes confidence was just pretending you weren't about to panic. And if I don't know what to do? Velrus's ears tilted in what he was becoming convinced was amusement. Then improvise at HFY-style. We find human spontaneity refreshing. The doors opened, and Ethan stepped into a hall that stole whatever breath the viewport hadn't already taken. The ceiling soared upward into shadows punctuated by floating light spheres. No, not spheres, he reminded himself. These were geometric forms that spiraled and shifted. Hundreds of Velithrans stood in perfect semicircular rows, their formal attire a symphony of deep colors and subtle bioluminescence. Every face turned toward him, every pair of elegant ears oriented in his direction, and Ethan Cross, mid-level diplomatic attaché who'd been promoted by default and illness, walked forward into the unknown with a broken datapad and absolutely no idea what came next. The music swelled, beautiful and utterly alien, and he tried very hard to look like someone who belonged there. The greeting delegation consisted of 7 Velithran dignitaries whose combined age probably exceeded the history of human spaceflight. Ethan touched fingertips with each in ascending order of the decorative complexity of their ear jewelry, a system he'd invented on the spot and prayed was even remotely correct. The last dignitary, an elderly man whose ears bore so many golden ornaments they seemed structurally unsound, gripped Ethan's fingers a moment longer than protocol, and said something in Velithran that made his colleagues nod solemnly. The translation device on Ethan's collar whispered, "May your choice bring clarity to clouded waters." Choice? That was an interesting word. Ethan smiled and nodded, defaulting to the universal diplomatic response of looking thoughtful while having no thoughts whatsoever. Velrus appeared at his elbow, guiding him toward the center of the vast hall. The music shifted, becoming something rhythmic and expectant, and Ethan noticed that the floating geometric lights had begun to pulse in time with the melody. The Velithrans really committed to their aesthetics in ways that made human ceremonies seem like last-minute PowerPoint presentations. "The 7 houses will now present their honored daughters," Velrys announced, her voice somehow carrying across the entire space without her raising her volume. Ethan suspected the acoustics were less physics and more technology he couldn't begin to understand. From a far entrance, 7 women entered in single file, each wearing ceremonial robes that made Ethan's formal jacket feel like casual Friday attire. The first wore deep crimson that seemed to absorb and reflect light in equal measure, her long ears adorned with ruby studs that traced their elegant curve. The second came in ocean blue, then forest green, then amber, each color more striking than the last. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, a choreography so precise it had to be either extensive rehearsals or some kind of cultural instinct humans had simply evolved without. They arranged themselves in a semicircle before him, and Ethan realized with creeping horror that they were all looking at him expectantly. His translator crackled. "The honored guest will now observe the candidates and make his selection to honor both peoples in sacred union of understanding." Selection. The second time that word had appeared, and Ethan's danger instincts were finally waking up from their nap. He glanced at Velrys, who watched him with an expression of serene encouragement that revealed absolutely nothing useful. The datapad in his pocket felt like a lead weight. Somewhere in those 17 missing sections was probably a detailed explanation of whatever was happening right now, complete with helpful diagrams, and perhaps a troubleshooting flowchart for panicking diplomats. A 6th woman entered, wearing robes of silver white that caught the bioluminescent light and scattered it in prismatic patterns. Her ears were decorated with platinum wire so delicate it looked like frost, and she took her place in the arc with fluid grace. Then the music changed entirely. The harmonies deepened, took on weight and gravitas, and every Velithran in the hall shifted their posture in a way Ethan couldn't quite define but felt instinctively. It was the physical equivalent of a room holding its breath. The 7th woman entered, and Ethan understood immediately that she was different. She wore deep violet robes that didn't catch light so much as command it, the fabric moving around her like liquid shadow. Her bearing was different from the others, not more elegant exactly, but more certain, as if she occupied space by right rather than permission. Her ears rose in perfect mathematical curves, adorned only with simple platinum bands at the base and tip, and when she took her position at the center of the semicircle, the other 6 seemed to subtly orbit her gravity. She looked directly at Ethan, and her eyes held the kind of intelligence that could probably calculate his entire psychological profile, while simultaneously planning next week's lunch menu. The elderly dignitary spoke again, and Ethan's translator rendered it as, "The honored guest may now make his selection, choosing the woman who will serve as cultural liaison and symbolic bridge between our peoples in the sacred tradition of." The translation cut out with a static burst that made Ethan wince. He tapped the device on his collar, which responded by translating the last 3 words as "Waffle Trajectory Commission," before dying entirely with a small puff of smoke that was definitely not covered in the warranty. Silence filled the hall. 7 women stood before him in what was clearly some kind of important ceremonial moment. The crowd watched. The music held a single sustained note that was beginning to make his teeth ache. Ethan Cross, who had a bachelor's degree in interstellar relations and a minor in xenoanthropology, who had passed his diplomatic exams with high marks, who had once successfully negotiated a trade dispute between 2 asteroid mining colonies using nothing but hand gestures and a napkin diagram, looked at the 7 women and made a logical deduction. This was clearly about choosing a cultural liaison for the trade negotiations. Someone to help him navigate Velithran customs, explain the missing 17 sections of protocol, and generally prevent him from accidentally insulting anyone's grandmother. And if you needed help navigating complex political waters, you went straight to whoever was in charge. the central figure, the one everyone else was clearly deferring to. The woman in violet who stood at the exact geometric center of the arrangement and radiated authority like a small, elegant star. Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand in the Velithran gesture he'd learned for indicating respectful selection, and pointed directly at her. "I choose her," he said clearly, projecting confidence he absolutely did not feel. "As cultural liaison and a bridge of understanding, for the waffle trajectory, I mean for our peoples." The sustained musical note stopped as if someone had murdered it. The woman in violet's eyes widened fractionally, her ears going perfectly, rigidly straight in a way that Ethan's brain registered as significant but couldn't interpret. Every other Velithran in the hall seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. The 6 other women turned to look at the one Ethan had chosen, their expressions cycling through shock, disbelief, and what might have been either horror or suppressed laughter. Somewhere in the back rows, someone dropped something that clattered against the floor with sound that echoed like a gunshot. Velrus's face had gone completely blank, the kind of professional neutrality that Ethan recognized from every diplomatic incident briefing he'd ever attended. Her ears had flattened against her head in what he was suddenly certain was the Velithran equivalent of barely contained panic. The woman in violet continued to stare at him, and one corner of her mouth twitched. It might have been the beginning of a smile. It might have been a facial tic that preceded someone ordering your execution. Ethan's xenoanthropology minor had not adequately prepared him to tell the difference. "Did I?" he started. She raised one hand, a simple gesture, and the hall fell into a silence so complete Ethan could hear his own heartbeat trying to escape through his ribcage. She spoke a single word in Velithran, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority usually reserved for people who could end civilizations before breakfast. Every person in the hall seemed to vibrate with suppressed reaction. Ethan's dead translator chose that moment to sputter back to life with one final translation. "The Queen has spoken. Accepted." "Queen." Ethan's brain performed several calculations simultaneously, all of them arriving at the same conclusion, which was that he had made a tremendous mistake and was currently experiencing the diplomatic equivalent of dividing by 0. The woman in violet, the Queen, his brain supplied helpfully while the rest of him began composing his resignation letter, looked at him with an expression that was definitely a smile now, sharp and interested, and entirely too amused for someone who'd just been accidentally selected for something by an idiot human who couldn't keep a translator working for 20 minutes. "Well," she said in perfect Terran standard, her voice carrying across the hall with the same effortless projection as Velrus, "this is unexpected." The hall erupted in controlled chaos, which Ethan was learning meant Velithrans whispered urgently instead of shouting, while maintaining perfect posture. Nobles leaned toward each other, their ears tilting and swiveling in what appeared to be a secondary conversation happening entirely through body language. The 6 other women in ceremonial robes had broken formation, clustering together and glancing between Ethan and the Queen with expressions that ranged from scandalized to gleeful. Ethan stood frozen in the center of it all, his extended hand still pointing at the Queen like he was accusing her of a crime in a courtroom drama. He slowly lowered it, wondering if there was a protocol for taking back an accidental royal selection, or if Velithran law included provisions for diplomatic immunity in cases of catastrophic stupidity. The Queen hadn't moved. She watched him with the kind of focused attention that made Ethan feel like a biological sample under a microscope, and her slight smile had settled into something unreadable. Her ears, which had gone rigid with shock, now tilted forward at a subtle angle that every Velithran in the room seemed to notice and interpret with varying degrees of alarm. A man in dark robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself materialized beside the Queen, speaking rapidly in Velithran. His ears were pressed so flat against his head they nearly disappeared into his dark hair, and his hands moved in sharp, emphatic gestures. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand. He was advocating for something urgent and probably involved removing the problematic human from the premises, possibly through an airlock. The Queen responded with 3 words, calm and absolute, and the man fell silent with visible effort. She then turned to address the entire hall, her voice carrying that same effortless authority. The selection has been made according to the ancient traditions of the ceremony of offering. The laws of our ancestors are clear and binding. She paused, and Ethan watched several nobles exchange glances that suggested those laws were about to become extremely relevant. I accept the honored guest's choice, as is my right and obligation. The whispers intensified. Someone in the back rows made a sound that might have been a strangled laugh or possibly a diplomatic incident in auditory form. Velrus appeared at Ethan's side with the sudden materialization skills of someone who'd perfected dramatic timing. She touched his elbow with a grip that seemed friendly but contained enough pressure to crush diamonds. HFY-style. Perhaps we should adjourn to a more private setting to discuss the implications of your selection. That seems like a really good idea, Ethan said, his voice coming out higher than intended. I should mention that my translator malfunctioned right at what seems to have been a critical moment, and I may have misunderstood the precise nature of. Later, Velrus hissed, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal genuine panic underneath. We discuss this later. But the Queen raised her hand again, and the hall fell silent with the kind of instantaneous obedience that made Ethan certain he just selected someone who could probably have him vaporized with a disapproving glance. The honored guest will accompany me, the Queen said, looking directly at Ethan. We have much to discuss regarding his unexpected choice. It wasn't phrased as a request, and Ethan had been in enough bureaucratic hierarchies to recognize a command when it was wrapped in polite language. He nodded, trying to project a confidence that had abandoned him approximately 3 minutes ago and was currently requesting asylum in another galaxy. The Queen turned and walked toward a side exit, her violet robes flowing behind her. Guards materialized from positions Ethan hadn't noticed, forming a protective formation that somehow included him in its center. He caught Velrus's expression as he passed her. She looked like someone watching a shuttle launch with faulty heat shields, certain of disaster but powerless to prevent it. They moved through corridors that grew progressively more luxurious, the bioluminescent walls giving way to actual artwork that appeared to shift and change as Ethan passed. One piece seemed to show the history of Velithran space exploration, tiny ships moving through painted starfields, and he wondered if it was animated or if he was having a stress-induced hallucination. The Queen walked ahead of him, surrounded by her guards, and didn't look back. Her ears remained tilted forward in that same unreadable angle, and Ethan noticed that the guards kept glancing at them as if monitoring some kind of important signal. They entered what appeared to be a private council chamber, all curved walls and furniture that looked grown rather than built. The guards took positions outside, and the door sealed with a soft hiss that sounded ominously final. The Queen turned to face him, and Ethan suddenly became aware that they were alone, that he'd just accidentally done something with significant political implications, and that his datapad with its 17 missing sections of cultural protocol was entirely useless. So, she said, switching to Terran Standard with an accent that suggested expensive education and possibly a better grasp of human linguistics than Ethan had of Velithran anything. You chose me. I made a mistake, Ethan said quickly. A huge, potentially civilization-ending mistake based on technological proposals from heads of state, military commanders, and noble houses so powerful they could purchase your entire planet's economic output as a novelty. That makes this so much worse. It makes it interesting. She moved to a curved seat that adjusted to her weight, gesturing for Ethan to take another. I have spent 2 decades carefully maintaining my position as unmarried sovereign. using it as political leverage and protection against houses that would seek to control the throne through marriage. And then a human attaché with a broken translator points at me like I'm a particularly interesting menu item. That is both accurate and deeply embarrassing, Ethan said, but he sat down because his legs had decided they were done supporting his weight. Can we undo it? Is there a ceremonial take-back protocol? The Queen's ears flattened slightly. Withdrawing a selection dishonors both parties and, more importantly, invalidates the political protections the ceremony provides. If I reject your choice publicly, it suggests I can be refused, which would invite every ambitious house to reconsider their proposals. If you withdraw, it insults the throne and potentially destabilizes our alliance negotiations with Earth. So we're both trapped in my accident. Fascinatingly trapped. She leaned forward and her eyes held that sharp intelligence again. But there is a traditional solution. Velithran law requires a courtship period, 30 days, during which you must prove yourself worthy of the selection. It gives us time to either legitimize this arrangement or find an honorable exit that preserves both our dignities. Ethan processed this, his diplomatic training finally catching up with his panic. And during these 30 days, you will live in the palace, attend court functions, learn our customs, and generally demonstrate whether you are capable of being more than an accidental nuisance. Her smile turned sharp. Meanwhile, several noble houses whose daughters you rejected will likely attempt to sabotage you. My political rivals will try to exploit any weakness you display, and the court will watch your every move for entertainment value. That sounds completely manageable and not at all terrifying. You pointed at a queen without fear or calculation, she said, standing. Let us see if that was courage or simply ignorance. Either way, Ethan Cross, you have 30 days to prove you belong in the choice you accidentally made. She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. I am Lysara, by the way. You should probably know the name of your accidental betrothed. The door opened, guards snapped to attention, and Lysara swept out with the absolute confidence of someone who ruled an empire. Ethan sat alone in the council chamber, contemplating the fact that he'd somehow proposed to an alien queen before lunch and wondering if the Terran coalition's diplomatic insurance covered acts of profound stupidity. His datapad chimed. Download complete, cultural brief sections 723. Perfect timing, Ethan told it. Really stellar work. The guest quarters they'd assigned Ethan were less room, and more small palace with delusions of modesty. The walls curved in that distinctly Velithran way that made right angles seem like a personal insult to geometry, and the furniture appeared to have been coaxed into existence rather than built. A massive window overlooked Velithra Prime below, the planet's surface a tapestry of bioluminescent cities that pulsed like a living circuit board. Ethan had been pacing for approximately 20 minutes, his newly downloaded cultural briefing open on his datapad, reading sections 7 through 23 with the desperate focus of a student who just realized the exam was in 5 minutes. Section 12, he discovered, contained a detailed explanation of the ceremony of offering, complete with historical context, legal implications, and a helpful sidebar titled Common Mistakes to Avoid that he wished he'd encountered several hours earlier. A chime sounded, the Velithran equivalent of a doorbell that somehow managed to be both musical and vaguely judgmental. Ethan looked up to find 2 guards flanking the entrance, their ceremonial armor catching the bioluminescent light. Between them stood Velris, her expression having evolved from barely contained panic to resigned exhaustion. We need to discuss damage control, she said without preamble, entering the room with the purposeful stride of someone conducting a rescue operation. The court is in an uproar. 3 noble houses have filed formal protests, and the Terran coalition has sent 6 urgent communications demanding an explanation for why their attaché is suddenly betrothed to our sovereign. I can explain, Ethan started. Please don't. Velrus settled into one of the grown furniture chairs, her ears drooping in a way that suggested she'd exceeded her recommended daily allowance of diplomatic crises. The Queen has accepted your selection under the traditional courtship protocols. You have 30 days to either prove yourself worthy or find a mutually honorable exit from this situation. She mentioned that, along with the part about people trying to sabotage me. Oh, they're already trying. Velrus produced a holographic display from her sleeve, images flickering in the air between them. House Meridian is claiming you were coached to select the Queen as an Earth power play. House Talvik is suggesting the entire ceremony was invalid because your translator malfunctioned. And House Corvin is circulating rumors that you're actually a spy sent to destabilize the throne through romantic chaos. That last one gives me way too much credit. The truth is irrelevant when politics are involved. Velrus dismissed the hologram with a wave. What matters is perception, and right now, the perception is that an unprepared human stumbled into the most significant political selection in recent Velithran history. That perception is completely accurate, which is why we need to change it. She leaned forward, her ears tilting in what Ethan was learning to recognize as intense focus. The Queen has agreed to this courtship period, which means she sees something in your selection worth exploring. My job is to ensure you survive long enough to discover what that is. A second chime interrupted them, and Ethan looked up to see someone new entering. A young Velithran woman in scholar's robes, her arms full of datapads and holographic storage units. Her ears were decorated with simple copper studs, and she looked at Ethan with the kind of frank curiosity usually reserved for exotic zoo specimens. "This is Kella," Velrus said. "She'll be your cultural tutor, etiquette instructor, and general guide to not accidentally insulting anyone else for the next 30 days. I specialize in remedial diplomatic education," Kella said cheerfully, dumping her materials onto a table that grew additional surface area to accommodate them. "You're not my first emergency case, but you might be my most challenging. No offense. None taken. I'm very aware of my situation." "Good, self-awareness will help." Kella activated one of the datapads, and a holographic schedule appeared, color-coded and intimidatingly detailed. "We'll start with basic court protocol, move into advanced ear language reading, cover the political structure of the 7 houses, and dedicate at least 4 hours daily to Velithran language immersion. The Queen has requested you be conversant enough for formal dinner conversation by day 15. Ethan stared at the schedule, which appeared to have his every waking moment allocated with military precision. "When do I sleep?" "Hours 23 to 6 are marked as personal time," Kella said, pointing to a tiny green section. "Use them wisely." Velrus stood, smoothing her robes. "The Queen will summon you for your first official courtship audience tomorrow evening. Until then, I suggest you absorb everything Kella teaches you, and try not to create any additional incidents." She left with the same purposeful efficiency she'd arrived with, and Ethan found himself alone with Kella, who had already begun arranging holographic lessons in the air around them like a teacher preparing for the galaxy's most important tutoring session. "So," Kella said, pulling up an image of the Queen that made Ethan's stomach perform an uncomfortable flip. "Let's start with what you know about Queen Lysara. She's intelligent, terrifying, and I accidentally proposed to her in front of her entire court." "Good start but lacking depth." Kella expanded the image, adding biographical data that scrolled past in Velithran script. "Lysara has ruled for 23 years, ascending to the throne after her mother's retirement. She's refused every formal proposal because accepting one would tip the political balance toward whichever house provided the match. Her unmarried status has been her greatest protection and her greatest burden. Until I pointed at her like an idiot. Until you selected her without political calculation, social pressure, or apparent fear of consequences," Kella corrected, her ears tilting forward. "Do you understand how unprecedented that is? Every other suitor approached her as a prize to be won or a throne to be claimed. You approached her as someone who looked qualified to help with trade negotiations. Ethan laughed despite himself. That's the most generous interpretation of catastrophic ignorance I've ever heard. Perhaps, but the Queen doesn't accept courtship proposals from people she finds boring, and she's clearly not bored by you. Kella pulled up another hologram, this one showing the 7 houses and their political alignments in a web of connections that looked like someone had tried to map chaos theory. Now, let's discuss who wants you to fail and why. They worked through the evening and into the night, Kella proving to be a patient teacher with an endless supply of obscure etiquette rules and historical context. Ethan learned that ear position could communicate 17 distinct emotional states, that the color of one's formal robes indicated political allegiance to various philosophical movements, and that the fermented protein dish he'd read about in Section 3 was actually considered mildly hallucinogenic and should never be consumed before important negotiations. Final question before we break for sleep, Kella said as the planet below rotated into its night cycle. Why did you really choose the Queen? Ethan considered the question, too tired for diplomatic deflection. She stood in the center. Everyone else seemed to orbit around her. When you don't know what you're doing, you find the person in charge and hope they can help. Kella's ears tilted in what he'd learned was approval, honest and pragmatic. That might actually work in your favor. The court expects political maneuvering and calculated strategy. Giving them genuine human confusion might be your best defense. She gathered her materials and headed for the door, then paused. For what it's worth, at HFY-style, I've tutored 7 diplomatic envoys in emergency cultural education. You're the first one who's admitted he doesn't know what he's doing. That kind of honesty is either going to save you or doom you. Any predictions on which? Ask me in 30 days, Kella said, and left him alone with his thoughts and a view of an alien world he'd accidentally tied himself to through a combination of technical failure and poor decision-making. Ethan's datapad chimed with an incoming message from the Terran Coalition. He ignored it, instead opening Section 17 of the Cultural Briefing, which covered traditional Velithran courtship customs and was illustrated with helpful diagrams he wished he'd seen before accidentally entering one. Outside his window, Velithra Prime glowed with bioluminescent life, beautiful and utterly foreign. Somewhere in the palace below, a queen who ruled an empire was probably reading reports about her accidental suitor, deciding whether he was worth the political chaos he'd created. Ethan Cross, who'd wanted nothing more than to conduct simple trade negotiations and return to Earth with a successful diplomatic mission on his record, looked at his reflection in the dark glass and wondered if courage and stupidity were really all that different when you couldn't tell them apart. His datapad chimed again. This time it was a message from Lysara herself, 3 words in perfect Terran standard. Don't embarrass me. Ethan smiled despite everything and sent back, I'll try my best. The response came immediately. That's what concerns me. He laughed, alone in his luxurious quarters on an orbital station above an alien world, betrothed to a queen through accident, and now bound to prove he was more than the sum of his mistakes. 30 days to either become worthy of an impossible choice or find an exit that wouldn't collapse an alliance. The bioluminescent lights of Velithra Prime pulsed below like a heartbeat, and Ethan realized that somewhere between the panic and the protocol lessons, he'd stopped wanting to escape and started wanting to understand what Lysara saw in his selection that made her accept instead of reject. He had 30 days to find out, surrounded by political enemies, cultural confusion, and a queen whose slight smile suggested she knew exactly how this would end even if he didn't. Ethan opened his schedule for tomorrow and began to prepare.